Hello and welcome to the Visible Women Podcast. I'm Kim DeBrew, and along with co-host Corinne Corbett, we put issues related to diversity, inclusion, and appearance in the spotlight and examine how they impact the lives of women of color. On today's episode, we're talking about Michelle Obama's memoir, and we're looking at it through the themes of this podcast as we talk about the lives of visible women everywhere.
What struck us most about the memoir, Becoming, is that it is so relatable. In many ways, Michelle Obama is us. She's had a lot of experiences that reminded us of things that we've been through. And we thought it would be a wonderful discussion on this podcast to not necessarily give away the book, because we know many of you want to read it, but to talk about how the book impacted us and brought to life many of the struggles that we all experience as women of color, overall, Black women in particular, and women who have been deemed invisible, or audiences who have been deemed invisible. And that brings me to a quote that Viola Davis made last week. She was interviewed for an NPR podcast, actually, and she talked about how celebrity has impacted her visibility. And she said, I always say that if I were not a celebrity, I would be invisible. She said, it's a larger question about how Black women are treated, how our femininity and beauty is appreciated. And the same could be said for Michelle Obama, if not for her meeting and marrying Barack Obama and them taking on this most visible roles. She may to many still be invisible, even though she is a visible woman.
Which makes her story so impactful and so real. So certainly, yes, while she was perhaps an unlikely first lady, if you look at the earliest pages of the book, I think there were some seeds in her origin story, is what I'm calling it, her home journey, her visible journey that started in the south side of Chicago, that really were the seeds of her being able to be resilient, unflappable, intact, together. Many of the qualities I think we admire when we watch her give interviews, talk to children, when we watched her blossom in her role as First Lady. I think when I read the title, Becoming, I was curious at the outset because I wonder what's behind that. And I think it really resonates with me as somebody who has worked with a lot of students over the year. And many times the conversation is about career goal. It's about where's your life heading, even with my coaching clients. Where are you heading with your career? What's the outcome you want to achieve? And it always frames the conversation as if there is a finite, tangible goal. There is a place to get to. And I think even in the title, she challenges that notion by giving a very long list of all of the things over time she's been and is still becoming. So it all started with her home roots. Corinne and I had a pre-conversation where there was so much about her childhood that was resonant. I went back to the sight, sounds, and smells of Bed-Stuy Brooklyn, which is where I'm from, and the stoops, even though my parents wouldn't allow us to, braid hair on the stoop because it just didn't quite look right. playing jacks, talking to our friends. There's so much about what a sense of community is, what it looks like, what it feels like. The cast of characters, like Michelle, I had the benefit of having extended family live in a very, very close proximity. And that sense of folks that you could count on, that you could rely on no matter what, whose birthday parties you would always be invited to, it told you who you were. And I think as you start to move further away from those experiences, it can be so easy to really lose track of who you really are. You have to squeeze into so many different shapes and sizes and forms, depending on the environment. I don't know if, Corinne, we're both New Yorkers. I don't know what lands for you in terms of resonance, but.
Well, I would say this. I would say she's from the south side of Chicago. You're from Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn. And I'm from South Jamaica, Queens, St. Albans in particular. And these are, well, Michelle Obama's neighborhood, or Michelle Robinson then, her neighborhood was more integrated maybe than ours were. But I think that in a lot of ways, our experiences of community were the same. And that your world within a few block radius. For us, for my sisters and myself, our world was definitely St. Albans, but our world was also Harlem because that's where my grandmother lived, and Brooklyn because that's where my father's side of the family lived. So our worlds we had several worlds, and we traveled to all of those worlds, but our, kind of our nucleus of our world was that, the areas of St. Albans and Springfield Gardens that we kind of travailed with our friends. And we walked to school as she did. My mom worked, so I don't know about having a stay-at-home mom, but I found it to be really, really familiar, the way that she described her growing up. And also described, even in elementary school, being set apart from others, having a mother who advocated for her and was set apart so that she could, get the most out of the school. But also what struck me was that talked about how you could live in a city and not really ever see it. And I know a lot of people that I grew up with or knew from neighborhoods who didn't go past a certain point. Like for us, it was Jamaica Avenue. The shopping district of Jamaica Avenue was an adventure. And I do know other people who live in New York that don't go downtown Manhattan, and 125th Street is their world. So these are real things for me.
I was just thinking about some of the neighborhood kinds of things. I went to church-owned, operated school where Black women were the teachers. And after that, I didn't realize it at the time. It was a magnet school that I took 2 buses through 3 neighborhoods to get to. And, I would say this about the unseen history. She makes this point: everyone on earth is carrying an unseen history. Those stories are not uncommon. So I am so grateful that she elevated, even though she was in a community of transition, that her elementary school really had a principal who was trying to make impactful change. And her mom could be an advocate where there were some challenges with, whether or not she was being challenged academically. I feel like that's a story that certainly I need to make sure I tell my daughter. I didn't think of it even to tell her until reading this. I made some notes about what I might want to tell her and maybe even some more junior colleagues that are kind of coming behind me. I thought of asking them to think about what are the markers of their story. So I thought for mine, it would be like an old school playlist. It might be calling my very, very best friend from junior high school and talking about some of our adventures and misadventures. It might be a visit with my daughter to my old neighborhood and pointing her to my old house, looking at a journal. All of those ways to really make those early experiences accessible so that we can use them when we need them. I would say if there's anything I would talk about from that section of the book, it would be how do you access that? She makes references throughout the rest of the book to those early times.
And you know what's interesting? Storytelling is all the rage in every area of business. And telling and accessing one story is really like key, like being transparent about who you are and where you come from and those pivotal moments that have really shaped you. And I thought it was really important that she made clear that she learned valuable lessons from her parents. Her father taught her a work ethic. Her mother taught her to use her voice and to think for herself so that she could, think critically about what steps and how she would react to circumstances that came her way, where she may be told that she talked like a white girl. I don't know if I've been told I talk like a white girl, but I've also been told I've been different from, people in the neighborhood. And how do you react to that? Are you insulted, or do you try to your best to assimilate and be part of the crowd? Do you dumb yourself down? For me, I was skipped twice. So I was skipped in elementary school and skipped in junior high school. And so that made me kind of like me and my sister Carolyn, like unicorns in that way. So what do you do then? Do you try to just kind of like not show your intelligence when you get to high school because you want to be more popular? I mean, how does that show up? So I thought that was interesting in that way. But also in terms of appearance, just as being a young woman in a neighborhood trying to negotiate and trying to get from one place to another, we've all, if you're in a community of color or as a young woman in general, trying to just get past men and young men who congregate together and learning how to deal with catcalls and to unwanted attention is also a kind of a universal theme that I've seen for many of us. And I recently was at UN's International Day of the Girl, and they had a bunch of young women who were called the players. So they were actresses who were acting out people's stories. And there was one story. So there were stories from around the world, but the story that struck me was the story of the girl in New York City who just wanted to get a chopped cheese sandwich, but had to deal with the unwanted attention of an older man who then chased her down the street. So she had to run home instead of getting her sandwich because the man wouldn't leave her alone. So these are kinds of things that, as our stories develop, as we grow into adulthood, that inform who we are, good or bad.
Without question, the body image pieces at very early ages are, you're so vulnerable to outside perspectives. Your first view of, what's attractive can come from those, so that unwanted attention. And, I'm thinking about the corner of my block. And when I first started to notice that, wow, there was something that was different about my body, is because men were ogling me, making sounds. And I think, it's a very vulnerable thing for parents to have to deal with, because I think it made my world a lot smaller. I think my parents were very worried about vulnerability in that kind of situation. So And it has an impact, right? It has an impact on decisions I make for my daughter. So
let's talk a little bit about this. So there was the neighborhood, the way the neighborhood informed her becoming, and the neighborhood informed our becoming who we are, our neighborhoods respectively. Just our transition from girlhood into teenager as our bodies developed, that informed. But then the impact of education, the expectations of educators in junior high school, and how that informs our becoming. So what was your experience? Did you have an experience similar to Michelle Obama?
So I think when I think of sort of similar experiences, as I mentioned, a magnet experience had a huge impact, long-term impact. So middle school, I went to a school that had a Black woman who had a vision for what Black and brown kids from very, very low socioeconomic communities could do. And so she built the school from the ground up. And I was in the second graduating class. And that put me on a trajectory that ultimately took me to a predominantly white college. Much of what Michelle talks about at Princeton, having very, very few students of color. So in a class of 600 freshmen, there were 20 African American students in 1984. And very similar to her experience, which was, he describes it as the cruel nuance of not belonging. I would say that resonated for my experience. And I came from a very, very diverse high school, large high school, and I just kind of wasn't prepared for feeling like the other, feeling like the expectation was that I wasn't going to be as smart, as talented, as ready. And it can throw you off your game. And I just sort of noted that she made the point that you need to be able to almost hold who you are, where you want to go, and where you're from together simultaneously so that you can make it through those moments. She also makes the point, assimilation still to this day is largely put on the shoulders of the students in the minority.
Exactly.
The environment doesn't have to adjust.
Yes. For me, what struck was her thoughts about not being enough before even going to Princeton. Just the nagging thoughts, that inner voice that you have to battle, that you're not enough in situations, especially if you have been othered in any kind of environment. So having a school counselor say you're not the right material for a college, or for somebody to say you're not the right material for, an extracurricular activity, for example, those things stick with you. But I also think that, that she models, and that her story models for us, that sometimes hearing that can galvanize you to prove the person wrong. And I think that one of the other things that kind of really a stark lesson, that's that your parents and your community want you to dream big in terms of your career, but oftentimes in marginalized communities, we dream big not necessarily for something we're passionate about, but something that makes others proud. And learning to know the difference is an important lesson. Like for me, my parents, my mom was a teacher, and my dad worked for in juvenile justice system, and the chief is was a kind of it's a city newspaper that gives you all the jobs that are happening, state, city tests that are happening. My father would bring that home and say, MTA is hiring, or such and such is hiring. And I just never wanted to do anything like that. But, and it wasn't that they were trying to dash your dreams, but that it was more about security. even for college graduate children. The city job was secure.
Yeah, I think one of the things that doesn't make it into maybe big public discourse is the survival instinct that's kicking in, not just for communities that are really in daily turmoil with violence very present in the lives of kids, but the survival instinct in our parents, working class, middle class, folks who know that opportunity via education, et cetera, is possible, and even with some skill set around directing us in those paths. Even for those parents, the survival instinct is critical. Lots of anxiety and fear about what if there's a misstep. The margin of error is very small and narrow. So I think that again, it's a question of story, making it kind of into what's talked about most commonly. I think our parents' story does not necessarily make it into everyday conversations.
So enter Barack Obama into her life, and he turned it upside down in a great way. A woman who was already a box checker learned to think differently about her goals and objectives, which I think is great. And along the way, she had to also deal with the fear that comes with being in love and married to a free thinker who has audacious dreams. And one of his dreams propelled her into the spotlight. We all know his story. But going from a U.S. senator to a presidential candidate propelled her into a position where her every move, her every outfit, and every word was scrutinized. And it brought up every trope associated with being a Black woman, especially being angry. She had to deal with her anger being called militant. She had to, even giving a fist bump to her husband was called a terrorist fist jab. Things like that take a lot of courage and audacity in themselves, I think, to deal with. And just understanding that although she always looked like she had it together, those were not easy times. And when she described her experience of, being female, Black, and strong, and to people looking at her, it was all about being angry. And that being an angry Black woman is a damaging cliche that forever sweeps the person that is being discussed to the perimeter of the room. So instead of having a seat at the table, you're on the outskirts. So this is the biggest way of being othered for us. And the idea that it's circular logic actually to be an angry Black woman, to even talk about angry Black women, because if no one's listening to you, of course you're going to get angrier or louder. And if someone is writing off what you're saying, you're also going to react and become more emotional. And if you are a woman of size, of height, or a woman with a voice, all of those can be perceived as angry. So in a lot of ways, this notion of assigning a trope and othering us and marginalizing us as angry is a way of discrediting our voices and our ideas.
Yeah, and I feel like we have to be able to call out the fact that she's aware in those moments of the moment, right? Of the limitations of the moment, the role. And, my question for our listeners and for myself and for you is, what's your move when you know this is code for what is the aftermath of white supremacy in our country? What's your move when you sense that your husband has a date with destiny, right? What is your move in those tight constraints?
Right. So all of us won't have a husband that's running for president, let's say, but we may have a situation that for ourselves or someone in our immediate circle that is risky. And for me, the story illustrates how we calculate risk, what's worth risking, and when, if ever, it's worth playing it safe. And it made me see, because even I'm thinking back to that time, first impressions of her, even being guarded, you assigned a story to her. Even though she was being guarded, we didn't know what that story was, but we assigned one that we thought was comfortable, what we thought might be comfortable. And imagine having that for 365 days, a year for 8 years. I can't imagine that. And it was even before that, because they campaigned for a year and a half. And that kind of scrutiny continues. So just hearing that it's not easy, but it's necessary is important to me.
Yeah.
So when we encounter the thing that's not easy, instead of retreating, if it's necessary, we do it. That's the way I feel. If it's necessary, you do it. But when I think about appearance and how that is used as a vehicle to other us, I look at, our forever First Lady, I'll flow this, Michelle Obama, and I think that how astonishing it is that, she was ridiculed about wearing a cardigan to see the Queen of England, and then ridiculed again for wearing a sleeveless dress for her White House portrait, and then ridiculed again because she wore shorts. And it is really, really a way to throw us off. First, if you're othered for your intellect, and then you're othered for your appearance. And her solution, in many ways, was to stand in her appearance and to stand in her intellect without saying a word. You don't like my sleeveless dresses? I'm going to continue to wear my sleeveless dresses. You don't like me in shorts? Well, you'll see me again in shorts. And by standing in her own confidence, she modeled something not only for us, she modeled it for younger women and for girls, that you are more than what you look like and more than how other people see you. So it backfired in that she didn't let the othering win. And I think that that's a lesson that we all have to kind of think about, that when someone tries to other us, as you said earlier, what's the response? And what she showed us is that sometimes the response is quiet. It's strong, but it's quiet. And as they're mocking or trying to destroy and denigrate your appearance, you use that very thing to lift yourself and other people up.
Yeah, you don't change the narrative by getting smaller. It won't go away. The narrative won't change. You change it by showing up more fully as yourself.
Yeah. And she said something really interesting about being in the White House and her work there being akin to being a swan on the lake. And her job was to glide and appear serene. All the while underwater, she never stopped paddling.
And I think one of the things that analogy is really common in business communities. And one of the things I tell my clients about that paddling is, okay, so I get why it's important professionally to look like the swan. And my challenge to you is to find someplace safe where you can actually do the feverish paddling as hard as you want. Find some place that's safe. Find some people where it's safe to do that.
What I think, finally, what I think was really, really important in terms of what this book illustrated for me is the importance of friendship, of having true and real friends. And those friends are not always from, kind of the sphere that you're living in right now. They are from your childhood. They are your family. They are from stops you've made along your way in your career, but they always have your back, tell you the truth, and are not in it for the glory. They're not in it for kind of celebrity adjacency, but they're in it to be true friends. And, I had I'm a member of some Facebook group where someone wrote, your friendship should always be, you should only have friends who can lift you up, you can get something from, or who are in it for the same things you are, that you have to be able to get something from them. And I said I disagree, because I think that your historical friendships have a really important place in your life. And this book illustrated that for me even more, because those friends who she knew from her South Side days were those people that she could be herself with in the midst of being in a glass house.
So when I think about the stories of my childhood and the most impactful show me who I am even now, they really relate to a deep, abiding faith and a community that I was part of in my home church. And the success measures even that I have, one of the reasons why I haven't been caught up by success as only being measured by the job that you have, the title that you have, and the amount of money you make, is because I had early visible role models and women in my life who were city workers, who were admin assistants, they would call secretaries then, jobs that probably paid not much more than minimum wage, but who were the boss within the church. You know, they were in charge of committees and activities. They were my teachers. They were my guides. And they found ways to reframe a narrative that externally might have placed them in very limited buckets. They would have, you are just this. And I saw how much more they were within church. And so it never mattered to me when I thought about my career. I mean, my parents had their hopes and dreams for my brother and my careers. And I saw other ways. I saw other models out there that were very impactful. And it really resonated with a lot of Michelle's descriptions of the people, places, and things in the South Side.
Yeah, I would say, what success looked like also for me, I think of my grandmother who started out as a maid in Madison Avenue hair salon. And she moved up and got her license, and then she was the wash girl. They called her the shampoo girl, but then she got her license and she did, and it was a white salon on Madison Avenue. And, someone in the Kennedy family went there, and New York Times reporters went there. And my grandmother, you had this air of sophistication and appreciation of the arts that had nothing to do with education. And it helped me just to see, to frame things differently, because she was the first person to take me to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She took us to Radio City because a reporter from the New York Times gave her passes. We never stood on the line. We just walked to the front and had house seats. It was amazing. But it also showed me that it's not about money, and it is not about station in terms of the job, because you can have a great job. One of my dad's closest friends was a very big deal at a motion picture studio in LA. And my mom and we had no idea. He moved from New York and he moved to LA, and we had no idea what his job was. And my mom went to LA for vacation, and she went to see him, Uncle Jocko, we used to call him. And we said, Daddy, how come you didn't tell us Uncle Jocko had this famous job? He said, because it's not important. He's just your Uncle Jocko. He is somebody that you can love and trust, and is good to you, not that he has a lot of money. That doesn't matter who has money, because money is not what defines who you are. And I think that this book in a lot of ways models that in showing us that the choices that Michelle Obama made in her career were not necessarily about how much money, but it was more about how much impact that she could make. And especially on other visible women and visible communities, and in order to make them visible and whole in any way possible. So, if we had to think of what the takeaways of this book were, what would they be? What would be one for you?
The first one that stands out to me is own your own story and have the audacity to change it.
For me, I think about what we just talked about, success. Evaluate what success is to you, and live that truth. Live that truth for yourself as opposed to what other people think.
And the third one, which is our familiar refrain on the podcast, you are enough. Michelle, you are enough. And we thank you for reminding us that we are enough as well.
Exactly. And that's our show for today. Look for the latest installment of the Visible Woman podcast every other Wednesday, where we'll tackle issues and experiences that relate to appearance, diversity, and inclusion that are relevant to your life. Check out our website, visiblewomenpodcast.com, where you can find out more about the episode and follow us on our social channels. Make sure you join our Facebook group to participate in discussions about our latest episode. Until then, here's to all the visible women out there. Never forget that we see you.